If there was one category worse than the unique assault rifles we had in before yesterday's patch, most of you would probably agree it was the unique handguns. Fortunately, Nexans seem to be sticking to their plan to buff the lesser used weapons, and while Restored Relic was what caught everyone's eyes initially, I'm here to tell you about the glow up that the Last Dagger just received. You know, the gun that does things like this.
Love the chase and the hunt, and I set the pace when I'm running. I always take what I want and I always give it 100. Don't need a...
So in this video we'll be breaking down my testing and go-to setup for the Last Dagger, talking all things to do with modules to get the most out of it, weapon cores to farm for, and which Descendants can push its viability even further. So pull up a seat and let's get to it. Now, of course, as we always do, we like to have a look at the base stats when it comes to the Last Dagger, the item card itself, and that gives us a good idea as to what kind of modules we should be building into. In terms of like the main kind of focus that we should be having on this screen, the firearm attack is pretty good for a pistol. It's pretty good for most weapons actually when it comes to fully automatics at 14,095. Has a respectable fire rate of 600. This absolutely can get pushed up to close to 1,000 if you do go into it with your weapon cores. But personally, I don't think that's going to be the way forward. Rounds per magazine is going to be sitting at 12 at base, but of course we do want to be able to lean into this a lot more. The unique ability pretty much ties in with the amount of rounds per magazine we do have with this gun, and it makes sense to be able to push this over 30. I'll explain that a little bit more once we get to the unique side of things, but just keep that in mind. Going into the weapon core side of things, we do want to be increasing the amount of rounds per magazine when it comes to this gun. The critical hit rate is 12% at base, which isn't fantastic, but it absolutely can be pushed up to 100% with the unique ability. We'll talk about how we can get the most out of that when we get to the module side of things. The critical hit damage is a fantastic 2x multiplier, which is going to be multiplying everything. That is going to be modules, that's going to be substats, that's going to be weapon cores, everything like that. It's going to be giving them a 2x multiplier, so this absolutely can get closer to 8 to 9 times critical hit damage multiplier, which is huge. It is crazy because this is a general rounds weapon, so we do get some fantastic ways of being able to boost that even further. And then lastly, the weak point damage is not as fantastic, but it's still pretty good at a 1.6x multiplier, so we can lean into weak point damage with this gun, and I probably would recommend that we do that when we come to the modules. Swapping over to the unique ability though, let's start breaking this down. When hitting an enemy, you get the unique abilities of Patience and Lethal Dagger. Patience is reset on reload at max stacks and grants Strike, and Strike consumes all of your rounds and fires enhanced rounds, and then when Strike is removed, you then gain Step. So basically it's kind of like a weird little cascading effect depending on obviously what you're going to be doing. Now, to be able to get Lethal Dagger, you will be hitting an enemy 30 times. It doesn't have to be the same enemy, but you do have to be able to get 30 stacks. At 30 stacks, you are then getting a 2.2% base critical hit rate per stack that you do have. This does then max out at 66% base hit rate. Add that in with the 12% base that we did have on the previous item card. That is 78 base critical hit rate, which then goes into with our modules, and we can absolutely push this up to 100% quite easily. Lastly, with Patience, we do have a duration of 15 seconds, very similar. This does go up to 30 stacks. At 30 stacks, when you do your reload, you will then get Strike. Strike is essentially taking all the bullets inside of your magazine that you would have had, fires them all in one single go, and then gives you a 16% damage multiplier on top of what those bullets would have done, and it just produces one single damage number. It's kind of nutty as to what kind of number you can actually get out of this. Of course, this does go higher if you do have a higher magazine size. It obviously goes higher if we go into weapon damage, going into crits, going into weak point, everything like that. So, and it also seems to work with the element side of things as well. So we can get some really nice numbers when it comes to this kind of unique ability. And then lastly, when it comes to steps, this is just some nice little utility that's going to help you out. You do have a duration of 20 seconds of a 15% increase to your movement speed. So you can use this and to be able to stack on top of, like if you used Inez, for example, when you use a skill 4 and she gets that movement speed boost, you will be then essentially just zipping left, right and center with this ability, as well as the gun being able to proc ball all of them off at the same time. So we've covered the boring stuff when it comes to the item card. Let's start talking about what modules we want to slot in here. Now, of course, we do want to focus on damage, going into base firearm, going into critical hit, going into weak point, everything like that to be able to really kind of like help us out when it comes to the DPS formula. Now, of course, we are going to be shooting this gun, and we are relying on that to be able to do the most damage, so it isn't a stat stick, so we do go for rifling reinforcement as well as action and reaction, giving us the biggest increase to our base firearm attack just to be able to help us right out the gate. Now, of course, we do want to go into crits as well, so we did also kind of like talk about that. Better concentration is going to be one of the better ones, as well as concentration priority. This is giving us a huge increase to our critical hit damage, and of course this then goes into that 2x multiplier, so it is a huge amount of increase to damage. Lastly though, when it comes to critical hit rate though, we kind of have two options. It depends on what you manage to get rolled on your substats when it comes to your gun. If you manage to get critical hit rate rolled as one of your substats, then you will go for something like Insight Focus. If you don't get it on your gun, then you can absolutely use Better Insight. So this is one that goes back and forth depending on what you actually need to be able to use. If you do go for Better Insight though, keep in mind that you might have to catalyze it to be able to actually get it slotted in for this gun. But in terms of this build that we are going for, Insight Focus can absolutely go in this slot, and then we don't actually have to catalyze it because of everything else that's going to be added in. Now the beauty of using Insight Focus over Better Insight is the fact that it gives us a critical hit rate, and it also gives us critical hit damage. This gives us an extra 6.5%, and of course this will get doubled up, so we actually get 13% increase to our amount of damage that we will be chucking out. Now to show off why Insight Focus is the better shout to go for if you do manage to have it as one of your sub-rolls, as I can see here, we do have firearm critical hit rate at 13.1%. So all I need to be able to do is shoot this enemy to be able to get up to my 30 stacks, as you can see on my left hand side. I'm now at that. I can then have an inspect. I'm currently sitting at 99.5% critical hit rate. Of course, if you do want that extra 0.5% critical hit rate, then by all means go for Better Insight. But if you do manage to get it as a roll, and as pretty decently as I've managed to get it here when it comes to firearm critical hit rate, then you don't actually need it, and Insight Focus will give you the most, because then it will also increase the amount of damage that you will be dealing with your critical hit. So that covers the crit portion of this build. Let's start talking about the weak point side of things. So of course we will be going into things like weak point sight, that's going to give us a really nice multiplier. Of course this goes into a 1.6x multiplier as well, so we are getting just over another half in terms of like the amount of bonus that this is going to be giving us. And then on top of that we will be also going for Focus Fire. Now Focus Fire is going to be giving us two things here. It's going to be increasing the amount of weak point damage we'll be doing, but it's also giving us extra critical hit damage. Now by all means you can absolutely mess about with being able to go into have aiming. One downside to that though is obviously this will be affecting the amount of accuracy you will be having. It will probably give you a little bit more DPS, but obviously then kind of affects your accuracy in terms of this, and it's already an accurate gun. You could go back and forth between the two. Personally, I like Focus Fire because it gives me some weak point damage, and on top of that it also gives me extra damage even if I'm not hitting the weak point, whereas have aiming is going to be a little bit of a detriment if you aren't managing to shoot your shot. So feel free to be able to mess about with that one. Feel free to go back and forth depending on the type of build you want. Personally, I prefer Focus Fire, but you absolutely can go in for have aiming if you prefer to go that way. So now we only have 3 slots left for us to be able to go, so we can actually go into a little bit more of quality of life because we've added in so much extra damage right here. One of the best ways to be able to go into that is going to be fire rate. Of course you can absolutely go for the blue one to go for fire rate up to give you an extra 25%, but personally I think we can actually go one better. We can actually go for fire rate concentration. Because of the multipliers that we have when it comes to critical hit damage, it makes sense for us to get an extra 13% increase to the amount of damage that we'll be doing. So we're getting an extra increase to our fire rate and then getting that extra damage on top of it. So this puts us at 750 rounds per minute when it comes to fire rate, and that's more than respectful. That means we're not going to have any issues when it comes to console players, we're not going to have any issues when it comes to PC side of things, and we get an extra damage on top of that. I do think that fire rate concentration is the best in slot for that one. Now the last two mods have a little bit of interpretation to be able to go in for them. The reason why is because while you absolutely could put a Cerulean mod here and be able to go into extra magazine size, being able to get an extra 5 to 6 shots on your magazine isn't really going to be helping you out too much. You get more of a benefit from actually going into it with your weapon cores. So in that case, I'm going to advise that you steer clear of going into extra magazine size on the module side of things, but you can absolutely increase the amount of damage you can do by going into elements. Now in this case, I am going to be going into chill enhancement. You absolutely can catalyze this slot even more to be able to go into all the other elements, so fire, poison, being able to go into everything like electric and all that kind of thing, and that means that you're then covered depending on the type of content that you will be doing, because chill or being able to go into extra elements will actually benefit from your unique ability as well. Every single time you crit with your normal shot, you will be then critting with your elements as well. It absolutely is fantastic to be able to go into that. It's essentially just a free increase to the amount of damage you will be doing, and if you pair this up with your reinforcement as well, absolutely you can get some really nutty numbers out of that. So this is going to be your slot that you might need to catalyze a few more times if you do want to add in every single one of your elements. And then lastly, we are going to be going into ultra precision strike and even more weak point side of things. Now I did have a little bit of difficulty with this one. I did kind of mess about and go back and forth between a couple of options. I did like build theorize with a couple of other people as well just to get an idea, but Ultra Precision Strike is giving us up to 90% increase to our weak point damage, and then he's getting hit by that 1.6x multiplier, so we can absolutely get some really nutty numbers and multipliers with going into Ultra Precision Strike. Now, unfortunately, it does come with that detriment that if we do miss up to 20 stacks of being able to lose some of our base firearm attack, but if you are going into Colossus fights, if you are using this with specific Descendants and everything like that, where it's really easy to be able to hit those weak points, I wouldn't worry about this whatsoever. The amount of like payoff that you will get from this mod is definitely worth that trade-off in case you miss a couple of shots, and because this is an accurate gun, you absolutely can laser beam some of those weak points away. So I do think Ultra Precision Strike is best in slot for this, and then this is going to wrap up the rest of that build. So I did want to give you an alternative to be able to help you out in some of your games, just in case you didn't actually enjoy Ultra Precision Strike for the fact that it does hurt your firearm attack if you are missing. I did then swap it with Sweeping Squad, because this one doesn't have a drawback. It will then also give you a nice increase to your firearm attack, which then doesn't disappear with any kind of like reload or anything like that. So you can absolutely get this to be able to proc off when it comes to your unique ability. And then Have Aiming is going to be along the other side of things, which is going to help you out with weak point damage to be able to increase those modifiers even higher. So this is an alternative in case you don't want to actually go for the bossing side of things, in case you don't feel confident being able to run Ultra Precision Strike, but you absolutely can get away with being able to go for this build instead. Now, in terms of substats, obviously we have already talked and touched about the critical hit rate, but I do think the best in slots here are going to be weak point damage, firearm attack, critical hit rate, and critical hit damage. Critical hit rate opens up a few different modules options for yourself, so in that case it allows you to be able to go into even more damage. If you can't go for that one, then obviously things like elements will be able to help you out. Being able to go for bonus firearm to Colossus if you do plan on using it in that kind of content absolutely can go here, and then you can just swap out for better insight instead. But in terms of that, I do think these are going to be the best 4 roles for you to be able to go into, and then obviously that will then give you more damage in the long run when it comes to it. Now, swapping over to the core side of things, I have messed about with this a little bit, but I do think this is going to be the best kind of setup going forward for you. We do have 2 tactical augmentations, 2 firepower, 1 free. Being able to go into your tactical augmentations of going into rounds per magazine is probably going to be the best in slot. If you do plan on using this gun with bottomless glade, then obviously feel free to be able to go for fire rate instead. You absolutely can get some nice laser beams in terms of the amount of damage that you can chuck out without the use of the ultimate ability or the alternate kind of like fire mode of this gun. But if you are planning on using both sides of things, then rounds per magazine is going to be the best shout, and that is really going to crank up the amount of damage you can do. Reload time modifier is up there, but to be completely honest with you, I found that doing more damage with the rounds per magazine was the best way to be able to go, rather than being able to go in leading into like 1 magazine and then 1 reload and all that kind of thing. I found that the best kind of balance is actually to go for 2 rounds. Firearm attack and being able to go onto that with our firepower. Of course, we haven't got a roll into Colossus attack with this gun, so firearm attack is just going to be the best generic kind of usefulness when it comes to this gun. It's just pretty much, you don't necessarily need the extra critical hit damage or the extra firepower attack to Colossus. You might as well lead into a generic build, and you can absolutely like wipe the floor with Colossus, as you've seen in some of the clips. And then lastly, when it comes to the free augmentation, once again, you could go into things like rounds per magazine, you could go into fire rate, but personally I found that the actual best one to go for, because of the multipliers on the gun, is actually going to be firearm critical hit damage, and the reason why is because this is a 2x multiplier, so this stat might as well be saying a 196% increase to my critical hit damage, and that is the biggest increase in the amount of damage that we can actually do across these stats. So this is going to give you the most amount of damage. This is going to be benefiting from your normal shots, this is going to be benefiting from your strike shots. So yeah, this is pretty much the best kind of like generic kind of setup, unless you're going for something cheesy or specific when it comes to glay. Now, I don't normally always put this kind of like section in here, but I did actually want to mention a couple of Descendants that actually can reliably use this. Now, pretty much every single Descendant can use this gun because it can get itself to 100% critical hit rate by itself. It doesn't need gun Descendants to get the most out of it, but you absolutely can get more out of it depending on the type of Descendant you use. For example, we do have Ultimate Sharon, which has got access to the Ambush mod, has got a ways to be able to reset herself back into to cloaked, into stealth. While she's in that, she does have a way of increasing the amount of critical hit rate that a gun does have, so even with Insight Focus we can get to 100%. She then has an extra increase to the amount of damage that will be outgoing when it comes to those shots. It is absolutely perfect to be able to go and set yourself up with critical hit rate. Then once you then pop your reload, go into cloak, and then be able to absolutely fire with that alternate fire, it will do a massive amount of increase to the amount of damage that you will be chucking out with that magazine. It's kind of nutty. I would recommend that you actually mess about with this one if you do go this way. Lepic is also another great great shout because you can absolutely use his gravity setup with this one. Being able to use it with power unit charge for even more base firearm attack as well is great, and it's also because the gravity kind of like keeps enemies in place, you can absolutely laser beam some of these weak points to be able to get some nice increased amount of DPS that you will be chucking out. Glay is also another great shout because of a bottomless mag. You can absolutely do some massive DPS with the normal fire of this gun. If you do go into fire rate, then this is going to be the best way to go for that one. And then lastly, all the way over on this list, all the way at the bottom, which is going to be the ultimate that's coming in April, is going to be Blair. Using Blair with Backdraft to be able to go into firepower builds with him. He's got a way of being able to increase the amount of critical hit damage you can do. He's also got a fantastic way of increasing weak point damage, and because the gun being able to benefit from both, Blair is also fantastic being able to go in that. So you definitely can get some nasty work done with him. And with all out of the way, that wraps it up on the video for my current Last Dagger build. When the patch notes first dropped, I didn't have high expectations, but after seeing what I could do with just an activator installed, I knew I had to max this gun out and see where it could take me. Is this worth your catalyst and weapon binder core now? 100%, and this thing can keep up with some of the harder hitting guns in the game. But this is a section I want to hear from you. How are you finding Season 2 and the update so far? Did you have your Last Dagger built before the hotfix? And lastly, which Descendant do you think is best for it to be used with? Let me know all that and more down below. Massive thank you for making your way to the end of the video. As I always say, keep yourself safe, keep yourselves well. I'll see you all on the next video.